Do good work is not a label, but a way of living. It is the constant and diligent effort to achieve a new level of excellence in one's own life. It is the hidden inner beauty behind the struggle to achieve excellence. It's not perfect, but imperfect. It is the effort, discipline, and focus that often goes unnoticed. The goal of Do Good Work is to highlight that drive. The guests I have on this show emulate this drive in their own special way. You'll be able to apply new ideas into your own life by learning from them. We will also have one-on-one episodes with me where we'll dive into my own experience with entrepreneurship and leadership. Every episode is designed to provide you with ideas that you can apply and grow in excellence in all areas of your life, business, and career.
Today we have Eric Ressler on the podcast. Eric is the founder and creative director at Cosmic, a social impact creative agency. Cosmic empowers social impact organizations to catalyze real world change by helping them nail their impact story, build brand awareness, and inspire action. In my conversation with Eric, we discuss social impact as a whole, not to promote a certain cause or a viewpoint, but in order for us to understand and bring greater awareness to enable you to make the best decision for you, your business, and your career. Well, Eric, thank you so much for being on, man.
Yeah, I'm really excited for today.
Eric, so we're going to be talking about social impact, what that means and definition, but I do have to ask, simply because we had a great conversation before going live here. What's the difference in your view from arts versus design?
Oh man, it's such a good question. I think the fundamental difference from my perspective is that design implicitly serves some kind of function and art doesn't necessarily need to. Like art can be done just for the pleasure of doing art. And design, I feel like if you're doing design just for the pleasure of doing design, then it actually just becomes art and not design. And as soon as you're doing design, there's some kind of purpose or function that it needs to fulfill.
I love that explanation because there is a blend between the art and design, but art is more like the expression and design being focused around a particular problem or an issue. And most of the organizations, if they're social impact based or organizations or even B certified, are focusing on making sure that they are solving a logistical, real human issue with the work that they're doing. That in itself can manifest in different types of work, different organizations, different company structures. But in regards to what you're seeing in the trends right now, where are we? Like, what's the status with social impact organizations?
I think there's a blending happening because for the longest time, there was kind of this, like, if you were a social impact organization, you were kind of by definition a nonprofit. And if you're a nonprofit, you were kind of by definition thought of as a charity where you're asking for money to do the things that you need to do. And certainly there's still a lot of organizations kind of in that position where they are a nonprofit. A lot of their revenues coming from gifts, some from, maybe large foundations, but a lot from individuals as well. But I think what we're seeing in this kind of purpose-driven business, B Corp, and like business for good movement, which we fully support, is that a lot of firms are starting and they're market driven in their revenue, but their goals are not profit. Their goals are impact. And I think that we're also starting to see that blend into the nonprofit space. And this has been happening for quite a while, but I think it's becoming more and more accepted and explored within the space that nonprofits are starting to bill for services or do consulting work as part of their revenue. And oftentimes the nonprofits have a mix of revenue that's a mix of gifts and grants and services rendered for fees.
I think that's important. And I'd love to see some examples or that you can give us in regards to how companies are market driven, but their profit is leveraged or used for other means. What are some examples that have you seen pretty well to execute this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it might be good to call out some of the more well-known examples just so that people who are listening can, have an aha moment. So, one of the kind of poster child examples of this is Patagonia. And so Patagonia is a corporation. They've become a B Corp. I can't remember exactly when. And, they sell apparel for outdoor recreation, essentially. They call it, I think, a really cool term, the silent sports, which is an awesome way of describing their niche. And, they are creating products and selling them and making a profit, but their mission and their vision and their values that they authentically execute are not driven around just growing profit year over year or making, the shareholders more and more money. They're doing activism, they're doing sustainability. They have a really famous campaign they ran a few years ago that was something along the lines of "Do not buy this jacket." That was all about rolling out their Worn Wear program, where you could, bring in a damaged piece of clothing and they would fix it for free as a way to reduce the amount of waste that's going into landfills from the apparel industry, which is quite large actually. So Patagonia is a really great example of kind of a social impact, social enterprise business. Another that's a little bit newer is Allbirds, and you may be familiar with Allbirds. So they make sustainable sneakers. And what's really cool about Allbirds is that they leverage their impact story so authentically in their marketing, and they've taken it to new levels. They've actually invented technology to make things that weren't sustainable in the sneaker production, the rubber soles, namely, and they've invented a way to do it, I believe, with sugarcane. In a sustainable way. So I think what I'm really excited about with regards to these social enterprises is that because they're coming in from a market-driven approach, they're also coming in with a more innovative approach sometimes around how to solve some of these issues. And I think the thing that I spend a lot of time thinking about is that there's no silver bullet answer to sustainability or social impact. It's really going to take a shared commitment between private institutions, government, nonprofit institutions to solve these issues, all from different angles and perspectives.
There has to be that level of collaboration that's essential, and communication channels to be on the same page to actually make a change or make a difference. Even if some of the organizations, if you're listening to right now, like, well, what kind of difference can I make? I think any difference does have a true value in it, because intrinsically there is that ripple effect that can, distribute from that one action. I'm curious to know, so I've had a few people who support the conscious capitalism movement, and I'm really curious to understand where did the argument come up that capitalism can be bad? Because essentially we're talking capitalism used for good, and in itself capitalism not being corrupt. So I'm curious to know where did you see in your time working in the sector that issue come up?
The issue of capitalism being bad before it was good?
Yeah, a lot of people have been mentioning that capitalism is an error, or it's I don't know, it's a problem. But for me, it's it can be used for good.
Yeah, I think that's really the distinction, is that capitalism can be used for good, but unchecked can have really dire consequences for the environment, for social justice. And, if you just look at the climate emergency that we're in, that is largely a result of us being irresponsible, and largely a result of kind of capitalist organizations prioritizing profits over the environment and the well-being of our species in the long term. So there's a ton of examples of capitalism either intentionally or unintentionally causing a lot of harm for the planet or for people. And I think that when profit is the motivation, and when the motivation is just to grow for the sake of growing and kind of feeding the machine and making more profit and scaling up, if it's not checked by the right values and the right intentions, and I would argue at some point by government regulation, then it can spin out of control. So I'm not here, and we don't need to get too into the weeds on this, to say that capitalism is always inherently bad. I don't think that's the case. And I do think that there have been plenty of examples where capitalism has led to innovation, improvement. It's employed a lot of people and given them livelihoods. So our entire structure is based on capitalism. And so I don't think capitalism is inherently bad. I think the way we do capitalism in America is bad. And I think there's a lot of room for improvement there. And I think there's a lot of people who agree with that. I think the next generation, this generation that's been labeled the conscious consumer, is demanding capitalism change and holding capitalism accountable. And I think that's a really good thing. But I don't think the answer is that capitalism must be destroyed and that everything must be changed from the ground up. I do think that what it starts with is just recognizing that unchecked capitalism, time over time has shown that it can lead to really bad scenarios for the environment and for people, and that we need to build a society where capitalism is used as a generation of productivity and output and moving things forward. But at the same time, it's checked by making sure we're doing things sustainably in the broader sense of the word, not just for the environment, but also responsibly, and making sure that we're not exploiting people in other countries to be able to, produce the items, or that we're wrecking the environment in the process, or that we're intentionally or unintentionally marginalizing a certain underserved population in the process. So it's something that needs to be looked at. I think, and it's something that's changing a lot right now, and it's something that I'm really excited to see where the next even 5 or 10 years goes.
I appreciate that answer. And for our listeners right now, team, one of my key perspective on this is for you to be aware of where you're at, where you stand, but also understand that, capitalism is a machine, or it's like a tool that you use, and you have the choice when you run your organization, when you're working with others, when you're seeing yourself in a bigger piece of a broader mission, how you can influence and how you can actually truly create an impact in the world based on the decisions and discernment. And just being aware of it, I think, is a first stepping point. Eric, I was recently it was a pretty cool podcast, actually. It was my first asynchronous podcast, meaning the host sends me the questions, I record them, they distribute it. I thought that was pretty cool because it shortens the time between meetings. I thought that was pretty sweet. But I mentioned a tip of building and designing your business around the impact that you want to create. And from my point of view, that comes into the invisible machine working behind your business. That's the operations, the systems, the whole 9 yards of making something happen. But I love to understand how you design branding and digital experiences around an impacted mission, because I know there's a lot of good out there and organizations that want to, expand on that good. How do you take that and pretty much package it for a digital experience so that you can actually communicate that across, create awareness, and then movement?
Yeah, I mean, it's really all over the board depending on where our clients are at, but I'll try and generalize an answer here. So we're really lucky that we get to work exclusively with organizations that are moving humanity forward in one way or another in the social impact space. And so by the time we meet folks, they have a really clear mission and a very clear vision around the change that they're trying to create in the world. And so our challenge is, how can we multiply their impact through the lens of branding and communications and digital engagement? And that looks very different depending on the type of organization that it is. I think the thing that we're really excited about is one of the silver linings from the COVID-19 pandemic is that there's been rapid digital transformation, even more so than the trajectory was looking like it was going to be before the pandemic. Already digital transformation was underway. These firms were realizing they needed to really up their game there. And, as soon as most in-person activities essentially got shut down overnight, a lot of extra time and attention was dedicated to figuring out how can we really leverage our digital channels to affect change and to inspire our community. And so what we've been thinking about a lot is, how do you build a community online, and how do you create these channels online, and not exclusively online? We're looking forward to the time, hopefully sooner than later, when a lot of in-person stuff can go back to a new version of normal. But we don't think that means that all of the work that we've been doing to build up a more cohesive digital strategy for our firms should go away. We think that it really opens up a lot of opportunities as well. So where does it start? It really starts at that foundational level that you were describing, having a really clear sense of, not only what is the change in the world that we're trying to create, but what are our values? Like, what is our niche in this ecosystem? Because oftentimes, especially for these intractable issues or these really complex issues, there's a number of different organizations working on the same issue from different ways. So what can you bring to the table? What are your unique strengths? And where do you fit in? How do you complement others? There's not really as much of a sense of competition in the social impact space like there is in the business world. So it's really more about, what's the unique strengths that we can bring to the table, and how can we leverage those more fully? How can we be really clear in our communications around who we are, what we stand for, our approach, our theory of change, how we're going to actually create change in the world? And then from there stems all of the kind of best practices around getting that messaging out in a really clear way, making sure that it sounds the same regardless of who it comes from within the organization. having a distribution strategy so that you're not just telling your story and no one's hearing it because no one knows you exist. And so that's really kind of the second layer, is like having that clear message and that clear position and that niche within the ecosystem, and then having a strategy for actually engaging people, joining conversations. And a lot of times that's building out digital experiences and generating valuable content that you can use to share and to inspire action, and then having very clear ways to take someone who's maybe just become aware of your organization, you're starting to get them interested, and giving them a really good way to take an action, whether that's volunteering or donating, or, you know, in certain cases for advocacy groups, writing a letter to the representative in Congress, and actually converting something that would usually just be interesting into action. And that's where we spend a lot of our time thinking about how can we make sure that we're not just getting people aware of issues, but actually taking action on the issues to make an impact.
And then that stems obviously from the beginning of the values. And I think that can be easily overlooked or too generalized before you can actually understand, like, well, how does this actually make a difference? And I love the fact of being a collaborative viewpoint as opposed to a competitive viewpoint of like, how can I bring things to the table? From your perspective, what are some of the top problems right now that, you know, social impact organizations face, even if they're nonprofit or for profit? Like what are some common themes that you're seeing that are, you know, hurdles to overcome?
I think one of the most common themes, and this is especially true for nonprofits, but can be true for social enterprises as well, especially if they're just getting started, is just they can get caught in what we call a starvation cycle, where they're essentially under-resourced from the beginning. And so because they're under-resourced, they have too many staff members who are, you know, over capacity, trying to do too many things at once, not able to focus on their key strengths as an individual. And they're not able to invest in some of these really important things like branding and communications, either because they just don't have the money, they don't have the revenue, or because their revenue is restricted, where it must be spent on a particular program in the case of nonprofits. So they know they need this. They're willing to invest. They just can't. They might even have the money in the bank, but they can't spend the money on this because it's not strictly part of a program. It's part of, you know, this overhead bucket, which has become a really bad word in the social impact space, which is really the wrong metric, I think, overall to be looking at. It's not that we should ignore overhead or not keep an eye on overhead, but overhead is really just the work that you do to make sure that the business can run. And it's this kind of weird double standard where we don't really care about overhead percentage for Apple, right? As long as Apple keeps putting out really good phones and technology that we can use that we all love, you know, we don't really spend too much time thinking about how much money Apple spends on their brand and marketing, because we know that it has a really good impact on their business. But as soon as you start to do that for a social impact organization, a nonprofit, you start to do this weird calculation of like, well, how much, if that money had been spent on the direct program, like how much impact would that have made instead of doing this more meta work? And I think that it can be really, it can be taken much too far. And, you know, this is not something that's a new topic within the industry. It's this overhead myth just doesn't seem to want to die. And we still have continued to perpetuate it through our actions as donors, and as well as people within the space at some level, intentionally or unintentionally. But, you know, you could look at two organizations and, you know, one organization might have 30% overhead and one organization might have only 10%. And, you know, right away you're like, wow, that organization must be really efficient. They only have 10% overhead. They must be doing great work. But organization A has made twice as much impact on the issue that they're working towards than organization B. So who's actually the more effective organization? So really, like, what are we measuring, and is it the right thing to measure? I think is really an important element that, but this is really a root cause of a lot of the issues that we see with our organizations, is that they know they need to do this work. They understand the value of this work, but it can take them a long time to fundraise for it, or they might not ever get to a point where they're able to fundraise because donors want to give directly to causes and they don't understand the benefit of unrestricted gifts.
Is that just the positioning thing of not knowing your return on social impact? Because even that metric is so hard to attribute and get a value for.
I think that's definitely part of the issue, especially with complex issues, issues that are systemic in nature. Measuring impact is really hard. I mean, there's entire there's an entire sector focused on how to best measure impact for these organizations. There's consultants that's all they do. And I think it's really important for these organizations to invest in that work as well, because if you're not measuring your impact, how do you know if you're making any progress towards the issues that you care about, right? And so I think that has led to, well, impact's hard to measure, but overhead's really easy to measure. So we can measure overhead and then claim to be a really effective organization because we have such low overhead. And so I think that's definitely tied up in this like kind of broader picture. But yeah, I think measuring impact is really tough. And I think what you measure really matters, and it influences a lot around your decision making from the top level at an organization. And you should definitely measure your impact, and you should measure your ROI on this kind of work as well. If we start to invest in our brand, if we start to invest in communications, if we start to invest in digital engagement, how does that lead to impact across the things that we care about? Is it growing our revenue? Are we getting more people engaged in the conversation? Are we making progress towards legislation that we care about? And those things might not happen instantly, but you certainly shouldn't go into this work blindfolded either and just trust that it's going to work out. You should measure that too.
Yeah, it goes the old argument, efficiency versus effectiveness. You can be more efficient, but are you more effective? And that's like, it's definitely a balance to be able to understand that. And it goes back to what you talked about in the beginning of having those core values, because those core values, even the best companies that I've been able to work with, thankfully, been able to see how you attribute, what you measure, what you look for, and how you look for it is definitely attributable back to the leadership, the vision, the core values. And that is definitely something that can be designed. And it's just being aware of that design. I think for our audience, there's like two, again, this is a super broad and generalization, but there's might be two types of, listeners right now. One who consistently give to organizations as philanthropists, or two that in their business, they either want to create impact around the work that they do. The simple one is like, oh, I sell a pair of widgets and then 10, 15% goes to a social cause, or that's a simple one. For the philanthropists, though, that we're giving to organizations, how can we become more, I don't want to say conscious philanthropists, but how can we make sure that we're enabling those organizations that need the support and understand and navigate through this sector? Because what you defined earlier, like you're under, in a starvation cycle, you're underfunded, it sounds like a business that doesn't create a profit. So how do you support those, and how do you enable and understand where an organization is or what causes to care about when it comes to giving?
Yeah, such a good question in so many different ways. So I guess where I would start is, if you can afford to give money, then you should, right? And not everyone can. And I think, we need to start from a place of respecting where everyone's coming from. And some people might be able to give small amounts. Some people might be able to give much larger amounts. If you're giving small amounts to these organizations, those are almost always unrestricted funds, which is great. And that can really help these organizations kind of fill in the gaps where they don't have funding covered for some of their overhead or for their staff or for equipment or some of the things they need to run their organization. And I do think it's important to support effective organizations. I don't think you should just blindly give to organizations because they're working on issues that you care about. And I think GiveWell is a really good resource that you can look at if you want to try and find organizations that have been essentially kind of vetted. There's also like Charity Navigator and others that you can look at. But really, I think if you can't, just to start with, if you can't afford to give, you should. And where you choose to give your money, or if you can't give money, time, or even just sharing and spreading the word about organizations is another form of giving. It doesn't necessarily have to be money. For those of us who can't, give money because of their financial situation or whatever, if you have some time, you can give time, you can volunteer. If you don't have time or money, you can just share the mission and the vision of the organization, or share a campaign that they're running with your networks. So usually if you take a second to look, there's something you can give. If it's time or money, or even just sharing, like one of those three things can be just so helpful for these organizations. So I would start there. And in terms of like who you support, I really think that needs to be values driven at some level as well. And Especially if we're talking about smaller donors, individuals who have a little bit of extra income that they're able to donate. That's awesome. And, I would personally recommend, just because the issue is so large right now, really trying to get engaged in climate action. It's something that we all need to be part of, making the change on. There's a lot of really good organizations doing really good work, but it's really going to take a collective shift in consciousness that I think is underway, which is great. And it's also kind of too late at some level. It's not really too late, but we should have started this conversation in earnest 30 years ago, not in the last couple of years. So anything you can do to get involved in climate action, I think, is really critical right now, either as an individual or especially as a business owner, just looking at your practices, looking at your supply chain. Are you moving climate action forward, or are you fighting against it, either intentionally or unintentionally? If you are in a privileged state where you're able to give a decent chunk of money, at that point, you should really work to find organizations that you believe in that are doing good work. And if you're able to give larger amounts of money, you can usually get a meeting with these organizations and understand more about what they're trying to accomplish and how you might bring not just your finances, but oftentimes if you're in a position to give a lot of money, you have a very connected network and other donors that you might be able to introduce to the organization as well. And there, I do think at some level, you can still, of course, it's always your choice to give based on your values. But the more money you give, the more you might want to look at what's actually most pressing from a global perspective versus your own personal values. And oftentimes those things coincide, but sometimes you might be really passionate about an issue, but that issue might actually be like fairly well funded. And there's other issues that are underfunded or underserved that you may want to consider giving to as well.
Taking the responsibility when it comes of giving to understanding what is actually most needed.
Yeah. And there's, a lot of work being done around this topic that I think just like broadly can be described as effective philanthropy. Like, how can we as philanthropists be more effective in our giving, more intentional in our giving, making sure that we're prioritizing the most needed causes. And it starts to get into an ethical conversation very quickly because most needed by whose definition, right? It really comes down to, who cares about what and who thinks what's more important than what. I think one we can all unite around, though, is climate, because without proper climate action, it's going to lead to global issues and already has.
No, that's interesting. I think it's important to also understand different perspectives and be open-minded for that as well. And then for, let's say, businesses that want to either contribute through creating new products or services, is there a pitfall when it comes to that? Or is this just as simple as I'm going to, for this amount, or this shoe that I'm selling, or this eyewear that I'm selling, I'm going to give a certain amount to an organization? Is there some strategy that we should consider before doing that in our business?
I think the overall take that I have on this is just make sure you're doing it out of a place of authenticity. Mm-hmm. If you're doing it as a marketing ploy, it's not going to work. It's not going to make an impact. And if anything, it's just going to kind of work against you. And I think especially the next generation is really acutely aware of the authenticity behind these cause campaigns. And when organizations are doing them truly to do good, either through just a give back program like you described, which I think is great, or through, a campaign that's supporting some kind of social justice issue, or through some kind of give back program like Tom's Shoes, where you buy one pair of shoes and they donate a pair of shoes to someone in need. Authenticity is really the key component to whether or not that program is successful. And that's what I would be thinking about in the case of someone in a decision-making position in a business is are we doing this for the right reasons? Are we doing this because we feel compelled to make a positive change and use our business as a force for good? Or are we doing this because we think it will, tick the sustainability box and the social good box and make it more likely that the conscious consumer class will think of us as a good brand? And if it's the latter, then, I would say it's not, you can try it and, you might make some impact, but I would really encourage you to search a little bit more deeply to figure out what is something that we actually do care about as an organization. Sometimes there's really logical things that hey, we produce this thing and, because of that, we have this really unique opportunity to also give back a certain amount of it to this underserved community. So if it makes logical sense, it makes it a little bit easier as well. And then I would also say that you should look inside and inward too, because there's this kind of almost this like ethical offset approach that some businesses will take where they're creating a lot of negative outcomes, either intentionally or unintentionally, through their business practices. And they feel like, well, if we just donate to a charity on the side, that kind of cancels out our ethical debt that we have by all the bad things we do as a business. So I think before you start to look at supporting organizations doing good, let's make sure that your organization isn't causing harm either intentionally or unintentionally. And are there ways that we can become more sustainable? Are there ways that we can ensure we're not exploiting a population to create our product? Et cetera, and start there. And then you have a really compelling and authentic story about being a business that cares about more than just profits, but is focused on the triple bottom line.
That's really important because that also focuses to the core values of the organization, and for you to do an introspection of regarding to your core values, the business's core values, your team's core values, and making sure that there is alignment to even consider this. Because if you're out of alignment, then either it might create turmoil within the business structure or even within the team itself.
Exactly. And I think the reason why I open with authenticity is because it's really easy for people to sniff out these days. It doesn't fool anyone. And I think you can end up, and you could even argue deservedly, getting a lot of bad PR for these cause marketing campaigns if they're not authentic, or if you're talking about all the good that you're doing for your cause marketing campaign, and in the meantime, you're wrecking the environment. People aren't going to stand for that anymore. And
Definitely.
they shouldn't.
Yeah, no, it's definitely something to make sure that, we're clear on all fronts. But Eric, I'm curious, so what's exciting in your world right now? What's some of the work that you're excited about and looking forward to?
Yeah, I feel like this has come up a few times, but it's not a coincidence. I think we're really excited about a lot of the work that we're doing around climate justice. We're working on a California-wide campaign right now that should be launching shortly. That is just a little too early for me to be able to like speak about publicly, but we'll be posting some stuff on our website pretty shortly. So if you're in California, especially, just kind of be aware of that. So we've been really excited to be able to dive a little bit more into doing work around climate locally and globally as well. And I'd say we're also really excited about the fact that, of course, as awful as the pandemic has been for so many folks, and don't want to be insensitive to the suffering that it's caused and still causes today, the fact that one of the silver linings is that it has really allowed us to all be a little bit more globally connected and not be so just kind of, I would say, like regionally focused in the work that we can do and the impact that we can make. Both allows some nonprofits and social impact organizations who have thought regionally for a long time to start to break out of that regional box and realize they can have an impact broader than just their region, and also how digital tools and digital experiences and digital engagement can be leveraged to scale their impact. And it can be a tool that can really help them grow and create a bigger and more engaged and activated community.
That's the key, community, and spreading that impact. That's important. For our listeners out there, Eric, what's the best place for people to go to thank you for this episode and learn more about you?
Yeah, I think our website is a great place to go, designbycosmic.com. We publish a lot of free insights on the site, and other podcast interviews such as this. We also last year released a manifesto that kind of talks about our philosophy and how this work should be done. That's a really great place to start. There's also an audio version of that you can get on your favorite podcast app. It's called The Revolution is Digital. And so those are some really good starting resources. And then, of course, if anyone wants to reach out, you can always just email me directly. My email is Eric, ERIC, @designbycosmic.com.
Excellent. And that email is going to be here for our listeners. Eric, thank you so much.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for the conversation.